In the sweltering jungles of New Guinea, the tide of war shifted with a roar of gunfire and the cracking of mortars. Japanese soldiers, once confident of conquest, now whispered in fear as Australian forces surged forward with relentless resolve. Letters, diaries, and intercepted reports reveal their astonishment, disbelief, and grudging respect for a foe they had underestimated. This is the story of a counterattack that shattered assumptions, tested courage, and left men on both sides questioning what it truly meant to survive the horrors of the Pacific War. The dawn of 1942 casts a long shadow over the South Pacific. Pearl Harbor had fallen, and with it, the illusion of American invincibility. Across the ocean, Japanese forces swept through Southeast Asia with a ferocity that stunned the world. Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East, had already crumbled, and now the eyes of the Imperial Japanese Army turned toward the islands of New Guinea and the northern approaches to Australia. Their strategy was clear: isolate, intimidate, and conquer, extending Japan's defensive perimeter to secure resources and strategic depth. Every island captured became a stepping stone, a potential airbase, a foothold for the next strike. Australia, thousands of miles from the main theaters of Europe, suddenly found itself on the front lines of a war that had once seemed distant. Its military was small, stretched thin across a vast continent, and largely inexperienced in jungle warfare. Supply lines were fragile, training was limited, and much of the nation's defense depended on improvisation and resolve. Soldiers from the 2nd Australian Imperial Force were being sent north, into the sweltering tropics of New Guinea, to hold what little ground they could. They moved through dense jungles, rivers swollen by tropical rains, and mountainous terrain that tested even the most hardened troops. The Australians were learning to fight not only an enemy but the environment itself, every step shadowed by insects, disease, and the weight of history pressing on their shoulders. Meanwhile, Japanese soldiers, flush with victories in Malaya, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies, approached the campaign with overconfidence. Diaries and letters reveal a sense of inevitability, a belief that Australia was merely another domino to topple. They underestimated the resilience of a nation shaped by isolation, by harsh landscapes, and by a military culture that prized ingenuity over numbers. In their minds, the vast jungles were obstacles to be crossed, not battlegrounds where tactics could bend and break an invader. In response, Australian officers coordinated small-scale counterattacks, probing the Japanese advance, mapping the terrain, and relying on local knowledge and unconventional tactics. Patrols slipped through the undergrowth, scouting for enemy positions, skirmishing where advantage allowed. Though outnumbered and often outgunned, they were beginning to understand the rhythm of the jungle, turning every tree, creek, and ridge into a potential ally. Maps sprawled across command tables, lines of movement drawn and redrawn as intelligence trickled in, revealing the vulnerabilities of a complacent opponent. The stage was set. From the dense canopies of New Guinea to the coral-strewn beaches of northern Australia, two forces braced for a confrontation neither fully understood. Japanese confidence shone bright, but shadows of resistance were gathering, shadows that would soon shape the course of the Pacific War. Unseen by the invaders, a storm was forming, one that would test courage, strategy, and survival itself. The jungle is alive with whispers, rustling leaves, snapping twigs, the distant echo of water over rocks. For Japanese soldiers advancing through the dense undergrowth of New Guinea, the forest was meant to be a silent ally, a pathway to conquest. Yet diaries and letters from the front tell a different story. Fear and confusion had begun to seep into the ranks. Small patrols reported skirmishes where the enemy seemed to vanish into the foliage, only to reappear moments later in another clearing. Letters from the field speak of frustration, of men questioning the competence of their leaders, and the unsettling realization that Australia was no easy target. Australian forces, though fewer in number, were beginning to demonstrate an intimate knowledge of the land that no map could convey. Jungle warfare had become their weapon. Soldiers moved like shadows between the trees, laying ambushes along narrow tracks, coordinating attacks that struck without warning and vanished before the enemy could respond. Patrols relied on stealth, traps, and careful observation of enemy movements, turning every creek, ridge, and copse into a potential battlefield. These guerrilla-style tactics were not just defensive, they were psychological. Japanese soldiers who had marched unchallenged across Malaya and the Dutch East Indies now hesitated, ears straining, eyes scanning every shadow. Post-war interrogations reveal the growing unease among Japanese officers. Reports filled with terse, clipped language hint at disbelief. "The Australians strike and vanish," one officer noted. "Our formations crumble under ambushes we could not anticipate. They fight with the forest itself." Morale, once buoyed by swift victories and nationalistic zeal, began to fray. Small setbacks, supply convoys ambushed, patrols decimated, positions lost in the blink of an eye were magnified in the oppressive jungle, each incident a ripple spreading doubt among the troops. Night brought no relief. Under the canopy, patrols listened to distant footsteps, to the whispers of the forest, to the faint crackle of movement in the undergrowth. Fires of frustration burned as soldiers struggled with both the terrain and the cunning of an enemy who seemed always one step ahead. Diaries describe tense standoffs, moments when the jungle fell eerily silent, broken only by the sharp bark of a sentry or the sudden volley of gunfire. Each encounter, no matter how small, chipped away at the illusion of invincibility. Rumors began to circulate among Japanese ranks, stories of Australians striking with precision, of soldiers emerging from the jungle where none should have been, of entire units forced to retreat under the weight of unconventional warfare. Whispers became warnings. Confidence that had carried them across thousands of miles now faltered under the scrutiny of relentless, calculated resistance. The enemy they had once believed weak and disorganized was proving cunning, adaptive, and dangerous. In the dense, humid jungle, the balance of power began to shift quietly but unmistakably. What had been a confident march toward conquest was slowing, each step measured against unseen threats. The Australians, though few, were teaching the invaders a harsh lesson. The jungle had chosen its champions, and survival depended not on numbers, but on understanding the land and respecting the enemy who called it home. The jungle closes around them like a living, breathing opponent. Rain falls in relentless sheets, turning every footstep into a battle against mud as well as enemy fire. The Kokoda Track, a narrow, serpentine path through the Owen Stanley ranges of New Guinea, becomes a crucible where courage, exhaustion, and strategy collide. Japanese forces, numbering roughly 6,000 men advancing south from Buna, believed their momentum unstoppable. Diaries from the campaign reveal a mounting sense of disbelief. Soldiers write of the Australians, roughly 2,500 defenders, often poorly equipped, yet unyielding, emerging from the dense canopy, striking with precision, then vanishing as if the forest itself conspired with them. The first major engagements along the track shattered any illusions of a swift conquest. Japanese patrols, expecting disorganized resistance, found themselves ensnared in coordinated counterattacks. Australian troops leveraged intimate knowledge of the terrain. Narrow ridges, sudden river crossings, and steep inclines became natural choke points. Ambushes struck the advancing columns, with small units inflicting disproportionate casualties. At Isarava, for instance, Japanese forces suffered over 400 casualties in 2 days of grueling combat, confronting defenders who seemed tireless, motivated by both duty and the defense of homeland soil. Journals capture the psychological strain. "I thought we would march to victory," a Japanese corporal writes, "but every step is met with unseen foes, and the cries of the wounded haunt us." Morale, already strained by exhaustion and disease, begins to fray further as tactical miscalculations compound. Attempts to flank Australian positions falter, supply lines become overextended, and the jungle's unforgiving climate amplifies every misstep. The interplay between strategy and morale becomes brutally evident. Even minor defeats ripple through the ranks, sowing doubt where confidence once stood. For the Australians, ingenuity is their shield. Improvised defenses, timely counterattacks, and the use of the environment turn scarcity into advantage. Soldiers endure the same mud, rain, and fatigue, yet their cohesion and resolve allow them to hold ground against superior numbers. Letters sent back to Australia describe harrowing marches through torrential downpours, the stench of disease, and the constant tension of unseen threats. Every ridge taken, every ambush survived, chips away at Japanese certainty. The sensory intensity is relentless. The slap of rain on helmets, the squeak of soaked boots through clay, the echoing screams of wounded men, the staccato rhythm of gunfire weaving through the jungle canopy. Slowly, imperceptibly, the balance of psychological power begins to shift. Japanese commanders, once confident in a swift southern advance, begin to record concern, frustration, and the unsettling realization that this is not a temporary delay. The Australians are not merely resisting, they are turning the tide. In the shadowed depths of the jungle, the first hints of a turning point emerge. What had been expected as a minor obstacle now signals a profound challenge. The invaders, seasoned though they are, start to sense that the jungle and its defenders have chosen their own terms of battle, a reckoning that could reshape the campaign entirely. The jungle grows quieter, yet tension hangs heavier than ever. Japanese soldiers, once brimming with confidence, now move with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Reports of dwindling rations, fractured supply lines, and relentless Australian counterattacks weigh on every step. Diaries and letters reveal debates among men about survival versus duty, some whispering of surrender, others of desertion, while a stubborn few cling to the notion of honor through resistance. The lines between courage and desperation blur under the oppressive canopy of mud and rain. Every encounter leaves its mark. Australian patrols, guided by an intimate knowledge of the terrain, continue to strike at Japanese positions with calculated precision. The defenders' ingenuity, ambushing convoys, cutting off retreat routes, and coordinating small unit assaults has transformed the jungle from a mere battlefield into a weapon against the invaders. For Japanese soldiers, it is both baffling and terrifying. One soldier's post-war interrogation recounts, "We thought the Australians weak. We thought them few. Now every ridge hides death, every river is a trap. We cannot move without fear." Moments of humanity emerge amidst the chaos. Civilians, risking punishment or death, provide water, food, and guidance to Australian soldiers. Japanese troops witness these acts with astonishment, realizing that resistance is not only military but moral, bolstered by a population willing to endure hardship for survival. Letters found in the mud speak of this grudging admiration. They fight not for glory, but for each other and their people. It is unlike anything we have faced. The psychological toll is compounded by staggering casualty ratios. In the Kokoda campaign, Japanese forces suffer more than 2,000 losses over weeks of continuous engagement, while disease and exhaustion claim countless others. Communication breaks down as units become isolated, orders delayed, and supply convoys ambushed. The jungle becomes a theater of attrition as much as combat, each day eroding morale and conviction. Close-ups on weary faces reveal the human cost, eyes hollowed by hunger, hands trembling over crumpled letters, packs stripped bare of rations. Soldiers cling to discipline, but the line between obedience and self-preservation grows perilously thin. The army that once advanced with the arrogance of invincibility now grapples with doubt, fear, and exhaustion at every turn. In response, Japanese High Command issues desperate orders to hold strategic positions at all costs, a gamble that stretches already fraying nerves to the limit. The men, battered and demoralized, prepare to obey, even as the jungle and their adversaries conspire to break them. The stage is set for a reckoning that will determine whether pride, survival, or sheer exhaustion will define the fate of the Imperial Japanese forces in New Guinea. By late October 1942, the the tide on the Kokoda Track begins to turn. Australian forces, reinforced and emboldened, launch a coordinated counteroffensive designed not merely to halt the Japanese advance, but to push them back across the spine of the Owen-Stanley Ranges. The campaign, fought along a narrow, unforgiving trail stretching roughly 96 kilometers from Kokoda to Iorabewa, sees the Australians deploying around 3,500 men, many from the 7th and 39th Infantry Battalions, supported by artillery brought painstakingly through treacherous terrain. Their weapons, Lee Enfield rifles, Bren light machine guns, and mortars, are wielded with precision, exploiting every ridge, river crossing, and concealed path to maximum effect. Japanese forces, numbering approximately 6,000 and fatigued by months of relentless engagement, find themselves on the defensive for the first time. Diaries and post-war interrogations capture the shock and disbelief that spreads through their ranks. "We expected resistance," a lieutenant notes, "but not this. They strike from everywhere, and we have no room to regroup." The psychological impact is as decisive as the physical toll. Supply shortages, disease, and exhaustion compound the effects of each tactical withdrawal, eroding morale with every lost position. The Australians advanced deliberately, employing guerrilla-inspired tactics learned during earlier skirmishes. Ambushes that once favored the Japanese now serve the defenders. Artillery is emplaced along high ridges, raining shells into enemy positions. Machine gun nests cut off retreat routes, forcing the enemy into choke points. Over several days of intense combat, the Australians reclaim villages and defensive posts previously overrun, inflicting an estimated 1,200 casualties on Japanese units, while sustaining roughly 600 themselves. A grim arithmetic of attrition, dictated by the harsh environment as much as by gunfire. Scenes of combat are stark and unrelenting. Explosions tear through the canopy, rifles crackle in rapid succession, and men trudge through mud soaked to the bone. Japanese troops, bewildered and cornered, make desperate, often futile stands. Some surrender, others fall back in disorder, while commanders struggle to maintain cohesion amidst the chaos. Letters found on the battlefield, soaked and torn, reveal the human cost, the fatigue, the fear, the calculation of survival over orders. As the Australians push forward, the Japanese retreat accelerates. Positions once thought unassailable crumble under disciplined assaults, and whispers of desperation ripple through the ranks. The jungle, once a crucible for Japanese advancement, now becomes a corridor of withdrawal, every ridge and creek marking a retreat that costs both men and morale. By the campaign's end, the counteroffensive has shattered the invaders' momentum. What began as a defensive gamble has transformed into an unyielding push that not only reclaims territory but reasserts Australian resolve. The enemy's shock and disbelief linger, setting the stage for reflection, reckoning, and the broader consequences of their failed southern advance. A legacy forged in mud, blood, and the unforgiving rain of New Guinea. The rain-soaked ridges of the Owen-Stanley Ranges fall silent, yet their echoes resonate far beyond the jungle trails of New Guinea. The Australian counteroffensive has not only reclaimed lost ground, but shattered the aura of invincibility that had accompanied Japanese forces throughout their early campaigns. Across the Pacific, morale among Imperial troops falters. Commanders are forced to reconsider strategy, aware that underestimating the Australians has proven costly. The victories along the Kokoda Track serve as a stark lesson. Determination, knowledge of terrain, and adaptive tactics can outweigh numerical superiority. Australian soldiers, many of them barely out of their teens, reflect on the grueling campaign with a mixture of pride and sober recognition of the cost. Diaries and letters reveal men worn by mud, disease, and relentless combat, yet emboldened by the knowledge that their endurance had turned the tide. The 7th Battalion, alongside supporting units, had navigated 96 kilometers of treacherous jungle, enduring shortages of food and ammunition while repelling a determined and disciplined enemy. Strategic mastery was forged in adversity. Every ambush, every ridge defended, every river crossing contested was a calculated act of survival and offense, a testament to resilience under conditions that would have broken lesser forces. Japanese soldiers, reflecting post-war, record a mixture of astonishment, regret, and grudging respect. Interrogations and memoirs recount disbelief at the Australians' ability to hold ground, the ingenuity displayed in jungle combat, and the human resolve that turned retreat into a lesson in humility. "We thought victory assured," a former officer wrote, "but the Australians taught us that courage and cunning are stronger than numbers alone." The campaign left indelible marks, reshaping perceptions of the enemy and redefining the operational approach to the Pacific theater. The broader strategic impact reverberates across the war. The halted Japanese advance into the southern approaches of the Pacific, buys crucial time for Allied reinforcements and fortifications. It preserves Australia as a base for subsequent campaigns, while marking a turning point in the psychological war of attrition. Maps detailing regained territory testify to the tangible success, yet the human dimension, exhausted soldiers, fallen comrades, and the unyielding will of defenders, remains the true measure of achievement. Archival photographs capture faces streaked with mud and determination. Diaries read aloud reveal intimate reflections of fear, resolve, and fleeting triumph. The jungle, once a crucible of terror and uncertainty, now stands as a monument to human resilience and strategic acumen. Courage was tested, assumptions shattered, and humanity revealed in every ridge held and every position regained. In the echoes of resistance, the story of the Kokoda Track endures, not just as a military victory, but as a testament to the enduring power of will, ingenuity, and collective determination against overwhelming odds.